Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome on behalf of the Boston Public Library and the Citywide Friends of the Boston Public Library. Welcome to this program this evening in the Talks for Better Living series. I'm Kristen Motti, an adult programs librarian at the Boston Public Library. We're so glad you've joined us this evening. Tonight, we welcome Professor John Jost from New York University. We'll meet John in just a moment. Our bookstore partner for this evening's program, Porter Square Books, are happy to ship signed copies of John's books nationwide. Use the code BPL26 in the comments box for your signed copy, and we'll put that in the chat in just a moment. Also, if you want to check your local public library for a copy of one of John's books, you can do that and borrow it from your local public library as well. First, a few items of housekeeping before we start. If you have a question for John, please type it in the Q&A box at any time. John will take questions toward the end of our hour together. Closed captioning or subtitles can be turned on or off with the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We'll share a few relevant links with you via the chat during the program, and a recording of tonight's program will be available on the Boston Public Library's YouTube channel in the playlist for Talks for Better Living. We'll meet Professor Jost in just a moment. He'll start with a presentation, then he'll be joined by Fred Golder, Citywide Friends board member and the BPL's collaborator on this series, for a moderated conversation before opening up to audience Q&A during the last 10 minutes or so of the program. Now to welcome, on behalf of the Citywide Friends of the Boston Public Library, and to introduce tonight's speaker, let's welcome Fred Golder. Fred, over to you.
Good evening, everybody. We are really most fortunate to have Professor Jost coming to talk to us. Just give you a little brief background. He's a professor of psychology and politics, and by affiliation, sociology and data science at New York University, one of the premier universities in the world. He directs the Social Justice Lab, and his research, and he's been doing this for many, many years, it addresses social stereotyping, prejudice, intergroup relations, social justice, political ideology, system justification, and the use of social media. You're going to hear from him his most recent book, A Theory of System Justification, Harvard University Press, and Left and Right, the psychological significance of a political distinction. He's past president of the International Society of Political Psychology. In addition to many other awards, he's received honorary doctorates from the University of Buenos Aires and Eötvös Larad University in Budapest, Hungary. He is elected member of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. I have to tell you, I can't imagine a more timely topic. You want to understand political polarization? This is the person that's going to explain it to us and help us live much better. Take it away, Professor Jost.
Thank you so much, Fred. Very, very kind introduction. Wonderful to be here. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Welcome. I'm very grateful to have this opportunity tonight to tell you about some of the work I've been doing now for 25 years or so in the field of political psychology, which culminated in the book that I published a few years ago that Fred just referenced, Left and Right, The Psychological Significance of a Political Distinction. What I'll do, if it's okay with you, is to spend about 20 or 25 minutes summarizing my basic approach and major findings and conclusions about how liberal leftists and conservative rightists differ in terms of their beliefs, opinions, and values, as well as their underlying psychologies. After that, our host, one of our hosts, Fred Golder, will say a few words and ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. And I'm looking forward to hearing what you think, so thank you very much in advance. My hope is that this presentation will help you to better understand some of the maybe not so obvious reasons for your own political views, and why they matter as much to you as they do, if indeed they do, as well as the reasons and maybe rationalizations for the political views of others in your life, whether you tend to agree or disagree with them, whether you like or dislike them, doesn't matter. It's something that I think we need to be thinking about and understanding at a deeper level than we have thus far, for some of the reasons that Fred has already alluded to. The political use of the left-right spatial metaphor, make sure I can advance, there we go, originates with the seating arrangements of the French Assembly at the time of the 1789 French Revolution. Members of the Assembly who supported the ancient regime, that is the church, the crown, kings, queens, royalty, and so on, and the aristocrats sat on the right side of the chamber, whereas those who opposed the regime and sympathized with the Enlightenment-inspired revolutionaries sat on the left side of the parliament. And so from then on, the right-wing label came to represent political views that are conservative, supportive of the status quo, and hierarchical in nature, as emphasized, for example, in the writings of Edmund Burke, who was an early and influential critic of the French Revolution. Left-wing views, by contrast, came to be associated with progressive social change and egalitarian ideals, as in the liberal traditions of Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, or the more radical socialist tradition of Karl Marx. Now, I'm not a historian, and I don't want to oversimplify what is obviously a complicated and multifaceted history, but I do want to suggest that left-right ideological conflict played a hugely significant role in the catastrophe that was the Second World War. In countries such as Italy, Germany, Spain, and their neighbors, as well as Japan, societies became deeply polarized about how to deal with economic and other threats associated with the Great Depression, among other things. And far-right dictators came to power even in formerly democratic countries with the support of self-identified conservatives, in part because of the fear of communism that was spreading in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution. The far-right credos of nationalism, traditionalism, authoritarianism, ethnic superiority, racism, nativism, homophobia, militarism, colonialism, expansionism, and so on, inevitably came into conflict with the more egalitarian ideals of liberal democracy in the US and the UK and elsewhere. This is not a talk about World War II, and in any case, we all know how that war turned out. Because the Allies won the war, liberal democracy was firmly established and reasonably well implemented throughout the Western world for the last 75 years or so. One of the great advantages of liberal democracy, in my opinion, is that it creates opportunities for leftists and rightists to express their points of view, their opinions and values, their personalities, and their social identities in a relatively peaceful way. Democracy is a system that helps people to regulate ideological and other conflicts in a fairly healthy manner. By rewarding appeals to reason, common sense, and majoritarian consensus, democracy generally discourages extremism, and in theory, it creates procedural mechanisms to resolve left-right policy differences in a fair yet decisive manner. So in a democracy, it's not that left-right differences are absent or irrelevant. It's that they're tolerated, they're openly debated, and they're managed in a civil rather than an uncivil way. In the US and many other countries, very obvious left-right differences persist to this day. And if you ask me, they haven't changed all that much in 230 years. Okay. So conservative rightists today are motivated to maintain longstanding social, cultural, and religious authorities and traditions, and therefore they are willing to defend and justify existing hierarchies based on race or ethnicity, religion, social class, sex and gender, sexual orientation, and so on. Liberal leftists today, on the other hand, are motivated to achieve equality in all of these areas, and therefore are willing to challenge longstanding social, cultural, and religious authorities and traditions. So the problem, as I see it, is not that society is comprised of leftists, rightists, and a lot of people in the middle. Problems arise when bad actors defect from democratic norms and practices, and when democratic guardrails are deliberately disregarded or dismantled. Then the left-right conflict can turn violent, even deadly, as we've begun to see lately, sadly. These problems, I think, are made worse by communication platforms on social media that reward highly emotional rhetoric, hateful propaganda, lies, hypocrisy, conspiracy theories, and subtle or not so subtle calls to violence. So I'm saying that the most fundamental, historically recurring basis of left-right conflict, in terms of attitudes at least, has to do with necessary trade-offs between equality and tradition. We've known from US public opinion surveys since at least the 1950s that as people become more and more conservative, they value tradition more and equality less. People on the right resist feminism, socialism, critical race theory, animal rights, expanding liberties for LGBTQ plus people, and so on. Or conversely, as people become more and more liberal, they value tradition less and equality more. People on the left challenge religious authority, capitalist accumulation of wealth, white power, male supremacy, heteronormative assumptions, environmental exploitation, and so on. So since at least the time of the French Revolution, if not before, we see that the push for ever greater social, economic, and political equality from the left is met with staunch resistance and frequent backlash from the right. There are other somewhat related personal and social values at stake as well. Studies carried out not just in the US, all over the world, find that liberal leftists tend to prioritize values such as peace, harmony, benevolence, universalism, and social justice, whereas conservative rightists prioritize power, conformity, security, tradition, and self-interest. To some degree, a healthy society needs all of these things, not just some of these things. And maybe this is why Western societies since World War II generally benefited from peace and prosperity for 75 years under conditions of liberal democracy. Even if many people did not benefit as much as they wanted to benefit, as much as they expected to benefit, even as much as they deserved to benefit, it still, historically speaking, was an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity. When democracy fails, left-right conflicts threaten to become unmanageable, to turn violent. This is because left-right differences are real. I wouldn't necessarily go so far as to say they are part of human nature, but close. They're important, they're meaningful, they're significant, and they can become deeply embedded not only in our personalities and social identities, but also in our lifestyles, in our everyday activities, behaviors, and our entire communities. So a psychologist like me then asks why. Why do some people prioritize equality, harmony, benevolence, progress, and universalism, while others prioritize tradition, conformity, security, social stability, and self-interest? The answer, like almost every answer to complicated questions about human psychology, has to do with both nature and nurture. We know that most Americans form their political attitudes in late adolescence or early adulthood, especially around the first election in which they are entitled to vote. There are strong but not insurmountable social influences of parents, teachers, religious and other authority figures, as well as friends and peers, the latter of which help to explain cohort or generational effects, such as why people who came of age in the 1960s became quite liberal or progressive and generally stayed that way. At the same time, there is evidence that left-right political orientation has a genetically heritable component, insofar as identical twins who are reared apart have significantly more similar political attitudes in adulthood than fraternal twins who are also reared apart. It's currently estimated that as much as 40 to 50% of the statistical variance in political orientation may be genetically heritable. Now, this does not mean that there is a specific gene or even a gene combination for political orientation per se. A more likely explanation is that there are psychological predispositions, and these predispositions are partially heritable and contribute to preferences for leftist or rightist ideas, assuming that a given individual is exposed to a reasonably wide range or menu of political ideas, as is typically the case in liberal democracies. Psychological scientists study personality in many different ways, but the most common way, the most scientifically accepted way, is based on a comprehensive taxonomy of so-called Big Five traits. And these are basically uber traits that people around the world speaking different languages tend to use when characterizing their own personalities and the personalities of other people. The Big Five traits that researchers in English have converged on spell out the acronym OCEAN, namely openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, which is really emotional stability or emotional instability. Okay. So we now know, after basically 2 decades of research, that liberals and conservatives differ consistently on 2 of these 5 dimensions and not on the other 3. The biggest personality difference between left and right has to do with openness to new experiences. Liberal leftists consistently score higher on every facet of openness, including curiosity, creativity, fantasy, sensation seeking, and valuing novelty and diversity for its own sake. The relationship between openness and liberalism seems to be mediated by cultural exposure, so that individuals who are high in openness are more likely to read books, articles, and newspapers, and to see a greater number and variety of movies and videos, maybe do things with the public library in their spare time in the evenings, and so on. And these indicators of cultural exposure are in turn associated generally with a more liberal orientation over time. Conversely, conservative rightists score higher on certain facets of conscientiousness, especially needs for order, discipline, achievement striving, and rule following. And there's a split decision on agreeableness because liberals score higher on compassion and empathy, even for people they've never met and never will meet, whereas conservatives score higher on politeness and courtesy. Unfortunately, not all personality traits are as pretty and lovely as openness, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. There are also more malevolent traits, and unfortunately, we're finding lately, at least, that these seem to be correlated with political ideology as well. Researchers talk about the so-called dark triad, which involves narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism. And they measure it with self-report kind of questionnaires to see whether people agree or disagree with statements such as the following. My own pleasure is all that matters. Hurting people would not make me very uncomfortable, and people who get mistreated have usually done something to bring it on themselves. A recent study that was conducted in 31 different countries found that rightists in all 31 countries were more likely to endorse these kinds of items than leftists. Psychopathy is a psychological variable that is understood in terms of four major things, at least according to one conceptualization, namely cunning and deceitful behavior, lack of empathy and coldness, impulsivity, irresponsibility, and thrill seeking, as well as antisocial and rule breaking behavior. And a very recent study has found that Trump supporters and rightists in the US do have higher levels of psychopathy than Biden supporters and US leftists. Now, a caveat, the people who have clinically elevated levels it's really clinically disturbing levels of psychopathy is very rare in the general population. But they did find that the ratio of very high elevated levels of psychopathy was 3 times higher in Trump supporters compared to Biden supporters, although the overall percentage was only 3% of Trump supporters and 1% of Biden supporters were showing kind of clinically troubling levels of psychopathy. But there are differences in kind of middling levels on this variable as well. And that can have some consequences, as I'm going to suggest. You may have noticed that these kind of malevolent personality traits, including psychopathy, are measured in very generic terms with no explicit mention of politics whatsoever. But nevertheless, these characteristics do predict social and political attitudes, including what researchers refer to as authoritarian aggression and group-based dominance. And to give you an example, in one nationally representative sample of primary voters in 2016, my colleagues and I found that right-wing voters and Trump supporters in particular were especially likely to endorse statements reflecting authoritarian aggression, such as what our country needs instead of more civil rights is a good stiff dose of a law and order. And what our country really needs is a strong, determined president who will crush the evil and set us in our right way again. They were also especially likely to endorse statements reflecting group-based dominance, such as some groups of people are simply inferior to other groups, and some groups of people must be kept in their place. And these attitudes, too, are correlated with psychopathy and the dark triad malevolent personality traits. Now, in recent years, we've come to see that some of these statements may not just be sort of idle opinions or threats. Since January 6, 2021, we've seen historically unprecedented levels of defection from democratic norms and practices in the US from some on the right, not everyone on the right, but troubling percentages on the right. And these kinds of malevolent attitudes and personality traits seem to be playing a key role. In a nationally representative survey of US adults conducted in 2022, my colleagues and I asked people how much they would be willing to defect from democratic norms, such as whether they would overlook politicians' methods if they managed to get the right things done, and whether they would vote for a blatantly anti-democratic candidate who threatened to throw his opponent in jail or declared, I don't care if the courts say this election is legitimate, I will decide whether to accept the results or not. And finally, we asked people whether they would support violence, and engage in it to ensure that their own party's candidate won the 2024 presidential election. Historically, this is not an American problem, even if other countries had problems along these lines. But things have changed. What we found was that people who identified as more politically conservative were slightly more supportive of political violence. Overall, very few people were supportive of political violence, which is the one optimistic thing come from this particular study. But they were, people who identified as conservative were much more willing to support blatantly anti-democratic candidates, norms, and practices. And these effects were explained in part by authoritarianism and group-based dominance. That is, conservatives scored higher than liberals on measures of authoritarianism and group-based dominance, and this statistically helped to explain why they were more willing to defect from democratic norms and practices. Okay. For decades, prominent political scientists doubted that ideology is a meaningful force in people's lives. The kind of evidence that I have brought together in my book and at least touched on in this presentation is, I think, at odds with that very skeptical position. We find that ideology is part of ordinary citizens' public and private lives in good times and bad. It's connected to the ways we live, the ways we eat, drink, travel, educate ourselves, participate in cultural activities, and how we spend our free time, and cope with personal challenges and collective crises, including the COVID pandemic. People do have clear preferences and predilections that have a psychological basis and that may be understood fruitfully in left-right terms. I hope that I have helped you at least a little bit to better understand the role that ideology plays, maybe in your own lives, but also the lives of others, and why it matters so much to some people. When we compare people who are drawn to liberal leftist ideas and people who are drawn to conservative rightist ideas, we observe clear differences in terms of attitudes, values, personality traits, orientations toward uncertainty and threat, towards equality and tradition, towards stability and progress, and many other psychological characteristics. What I think we need from our democratic institutions and our political leaders is a way to understand and resolve our many important differences in the spirit of good faith deliberation and debate, with fairly implemented, truly representative elections to break the inevitable stalemates that will arise. Unfortunately, we've seen far too many bad faith actors in the ideological arena. In our country and all over the world, I think we need to find ways of doing democracy better, much better, taking into account both our similarities and our differences as people. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Goodness gracious. I have so many questions. Before I get to the questions, and I know there are people out there that are going to have many questions as well. I discovered John several years ago as a Braver Angels ambassador, which is a nonprofit organization trying to get people left and right together to learn to navigate things. And so I knew that John was not one, but the expert on political differences and dimensions. And I called him up and he said, what a coincidence. I'm just about to finish a book. And that was his book, Left and Right. And I read the book. It was amazing. And I was able to glean from that these significant differences. The book was so meaningful to me. I read it twice, and I'm not sure whether all your relatives have read it twice, but I read the book twice.
Thank you, Fred.
And I will tell you that it's an expensive book, but it's worth every penny. We had this conversation. A good meal or a mediocre meal cost you $100. This book costs less than that, and it will provide such value as you go forward, understanding the differences between left and right and how to navigate those differences in what I like to say political, not sameness, but working together for a common goal and a common purpose. So I just wanted to start that out. But then I have these questions, and well, first of all, how did you get into doing research on these political dimensions? That's the first question I have.
Okay. Um, I guess I've always been interested in politics since I was a kid. I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, which was a tiny little blue spot in a big red sea. And I was aware early on, even as a kid, that the people in in the center of the city in Cincinnati and near the university were much more liberal than the people just a few miles outside. And I noticed it again at Duke University, where there were clearly differences between liberal leftist kind of activists and conservative rightist students at Duke University. And I learned about the work of Sylvan Tompkins. I'm getting an echo. Are you all getting an echo too? Maybe Amanda can do something about the echo. Um, that's better. Thanks. Um, and I learned about the work of Irving. Sorry, one of my professors was called Irving Alexander. He was a really fascinating man, a clinical psychologist, studied personality, and knew a lot about social psychology and politics as well. And his mentor was a person named Sylvan Tompkins, who came up with a theory of left and right as a basic dimension of human personality back in the 1960s. And he had a biological evolutionary approach, but also a very historically sophisticated one. And I read about that and learned about that, and then it was kind of in the back of my mind. And then it came back to me maybe 10 years later, after 9/11, after polarization started to increase in the United States. Um, and when I was a postdoc, we started thinking about what are the psychological factors that would lead someone to be more or less conservative versus more or less progressive. Um, and I've devoted most of the last 20, 25 years of my career to studying it.
Now, I know in your book you talk about certain things that can cause people to move left or move right. Explain that a little bit more for us.
Right. Well, so I mentioned that there is evidence that there's some genetic component to things, but again, I think that's mediated by psychological dispositions and predispositions. Some psychological dispositions are fairly stable throughout the life course. Others change quite a bit. So it's not as if things are fixed in plaster or set in stone. There are things in life that can make people move either to the left or to the right. And I think it's hard to study these things because you need to take a life course, a lifespan approach, and you need to spend time, years really, with people before and after significant events in their lives. But the things that I think I'm most convinced of at this point in time that move people to the left are things like education and travel. And I think what these things have in common is they expose people to different cultures, different ideas, different disciplines, different everything, and they do so in a way that is usually non-threatening, that doesn't increase people's fear or threat of the other and of differences. Instead, it gives them increased familiarity and comfort with things that are different from what they've known. And so I think education and travel help people to become more open in that way to others and to differences, and therefore more supportive of equality and diversity and things like this. On the right side, I think that things like threat, highly intense threat situations such as terrorist attacks, sometimes wars, crises of that nature that create the opposite, that increase feelings of threat and insecurity and concern and distrust and suspicion of others, and reinforces both a kind of us them mentality because they're threatening to us, but also um, a need to kind of put your trust in authority figures to defend and protect you. And sometimes you end up wanting to give them a lot of power.
I know you talk quite a bit about authoritarianism in your book, uh, and that's a real concern to me, and I'm sure it's a concern to everybody else. Um, and you talked about the characteristics of authoritarianism, um, and if you could talk a little bit about that, and I'm going to really put you on the spot. I'm looking for solutions, and I think the people out there are looking for solutions. So what is authoritarianism as you see it, and what are the solutions so that we don't get ourselves into a terrible mess?
Yeah. Uh, Well, first of all, authoritarianism can be a property of individuals and groups, or it can be a property of social systems. And to answer your what do we do about it question, I think you have to deal with it at the level of the social system. And I do think that is the goal and the intent of liberal democratic social systems is to prevent authoritarian impulses that human beings do have, and there may even be a kind of evolutionary origin for some of our more authoritarian inclinations. But the social system uh, that uh, that that favors something like liberal democracy, it creates mechanisms and guardrails, puts them in place to prevent uh, authoritarian leaders from getting too much power and abusing that power. And that is the very point of democracy. And that's why I think this is the moment when we have to stand up and defend that. And I just don't see any alternative to that other than living in chains, most people living in chains for a long time.
Do you think that when people understand that the ideological differences are sometimes, well, genetically and environmentally and culturally, so that nurture and nature, people have these ideological views based upon things that they really have no control over, very little control. For example, we have no control over our genes. We have no control over how we grow up or the cultural environment in which we get nurtured. So you put all that together and you say, well, I can understand why he leans left. I can understand why he leans right. And maybe having that basic understanding might help us realize that he or she is left or right, not necessarily because it's the right way to be, but it's because that's how they are.
Yeah, which is not to say there is no right or wrong way to be, or better or worse way to be, but it may be a matter of luck if you end up in a situation where you're exposed to a political culture, let's say that is open and tolerant and supportive of democratic values and treats everyone with respect and dignity and so on. I think that's right. I think there is a matter of luck in that. Hopefully, if it's a free society, once you're an adult, you are able then to make decisions and choices about what kinds of environments you want to be in from then on.
We'll talk about a democratic imbalance. Um, and I wonder, what can we do as citizens to perhaps maybe change the imbalance that's out there? Because it does seem pretty intense right now.
It is intense. It is intense, and I one of the problems with authoritarian leaders, I think, is that they don't even necessarily follow the the values of their own supporters consistently, and they do things that serve themselves rather than the people. And even if they're elected in a democracy, um, so I think again restoring uh, pro-democratic measures that rein in autocratic tendencies in leaders. Um, it's what has to be done. It's what the courts have to do. It's what society has to do. It's what voters have to do. It's what everyone in government needs to be held responsible for doing, and the people have to force them to do it. Sorry, Fred. I think you're muted. You're muted, Fred. I can't hear you. There you go. Okay.
Okay.
I didn't hear the last part, Fred.
Well, that's okay. The reason I muted myself, I didn't want to have that feedback that we were getting.
Yeah.
So I uh, basically what we have
I
to
thought
do
I thought you
is
were cursing or something.
no, not at all. So what we really have to do as individuals is to be more involved in what's going on. At least that's what it sounds like, and that we can't sit back and wait for somebody else to do it. We have to be part of the solution by learning to talk to each other despite our differences. It sounds like. And so I'm going to have one more question, and then we uh, set up for the audience. Do you have any tips on how people on the left and right can learn to work together to solve all the problems we're facing? Simple question.
Yeah. Clear. I certainly had more optimism about that 20 years ago than I have now, in the United States about given our current state of things. It seems like compromise is not happening, and the distrust is widening, and so on. So, but again, that is exactly the point of democracy: is we lay out the options that have a decent chance of getting, 51% of people to say that's the direction we go in. We lay it all out. We debate the pros and cons of both sides. We have a free and fair election in which every vote counts, and we make a decision as a group. We're going to make this decision and go this way. And then if we have to revisit it again in subsequent years, we'll do that. But for now, this is how we're going to settle it. So, in other words, I don't think individuals can, certainly not um, highly polarized individuals on the left and right themselves, are going to come up with good solutions. I think that we have to trust the wisdom of the crowd to differentiate between better and worse policies to pursue. And we need to be exposed to good evidence, not misinformation, disinformation, and so on when we do it.
Well, I there's a lot to digest. I again will suggest that if you really want to understand this uh, thoroughly, that you buy
Mhm.
John's book and read it thoroughly. And I will tell you that reading it has given me insight into why we're polarized and how we can fix it. Really, you've got some good ideas there about fixing it, and I think we should work on it. Now, um, we have opened up for questions to the audience.
Hi, Kristen.
Hi. We have a few questions from the audience, and the first one is to dovetail with what you were just talking about. Can political polarization ever be good?
Yes, yes. Um, if we had no differences of opinion, we would not have a healthy democracy. We have to get the ideas out. We have to debate them. We have to get people to understand what the costs and benefits of different directions are, policy wise, and then we have to let the people decide, and we have to try it. And I think we should be doing more experimenting and trying new ideas. But we also need to be honest about whether the ideas are working or not. We need honest intervention type of research to find out what the actual consequences of specific policies are. For that, we need expertise. We need to trust experts to tell us the truth. And we have to rebuild, in that sense, institutional trust in the system of democracy as well as the system of experts in social science, in government, in journalism, and so on. Because it's really the only way. Otherwise, we're literally operating in the dark.
Thank you. The next question is, has your research ever shown difference between left and right beliefs in science and fact-based evidence? Do you think the erosion of trust and politicization, can't pronounce that, of science today worldwide is due to polarization or simply politicians? It's a big one.
It's a good question. Part of the reason for the polarization, of course, is the politicians, that some politicians consider it to be in their interest to demonize their opponents, and sometimes it works if people let them get away with it. Um, so the polarization is often stoked by the politicians themselves, but the parties are working, so to speak, with different psychological materials in their constituencies, in their natural constituencies. And so, yes, I've done a lot of research actually on differences in what we call epistemic motivation in things like needs for order, structure, and closure. How much people are curious about things, how much people want to uh, continue to think about the complexities of issues versus make a quick decision, stick with it, be firm with that. How much people want to open it up to the methods of science, which are, after all, democratic, by the way, and egalitarian, and came out of the same Enlightenment period in which the idea was that we don't just trust this small group of religious authorities to tell us what's true. We open it up to the public and for investigation and discussion and rational discourse, and eventually the scientific methods that we develop to try to get better answers to the questions. It's an inherently democratic, open, and liberal, frankly, method. And so it was inevitable. Maybe it was climate change that made it inevitable, the issue of climate change and the fact that it became a scientific debate, that many people wanted to drown out the scientific voices in that debate. It essentially goes back to French Revolution times of do we trust the scientific process, or do we trust authorities to tell us what's true and what's right? Yeah, it's a huge issue. There's no question about it. Science polarization is a massively important issue. I study it. Many of my colleagues are studying it now too. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Very, very quickly, if I just have a very significant concern about the confirmation bias, and maybe people don't understand how significant that is because it influences how we make decisions. We ignore things that are different than our own opinions and ideas. We reject those, and we only accept things that sort of already confirm our opinion. And I think maybe if people understand the confirmation bias, how significant it is and how we think, that it might help us perhaps realize that we need both left and right. What do you think?
Yes, confirmation bias is a significant problem in the sense that we are certainly more open to new information that is consistent with our pre-existing beliefs and opinions, and we sometimes use different standards in judging those things. I think it's a very, very complicated question, however, whether in practice that is, in specific cases, that is rational or irrational. Because Fred, you're a lawyer with right, years and years of experience with the law. I'm not. So if I tell you something that sounds crazy based on your experiences, I think you should be skeptical of that because you have expertise in that area. And so I'm not sure the answer is for you as an expert with a lot of pre-existing knowledge and information to ignore all that when you hear some new thing that seems to conflict with your 20 or 30 or 40 years of experience. So sometimes what looks like confirmation bias can be some people are experts and they know that that is nonsense.
Well, put it this way, I've been educated to think in a way that it's very interesting. Have you got any evidence to support that idea or that opinion or that theory? And if they have no evidence to support it, I guess we can just disregard it. The
Yeah,
other thing, the
I think
other thing,
that's one of the best things that education does for you is it gets you onto thinking about how would we answer that question in a reasonable and rational way? What is the evidence for it? Not just I like you, you said it, so I'm going to agree with you.
and the other thing that we get from that Daniel Kahneman's book about thinking fast and slow, oftentimes we make decisions emotionally, and then brain number two kicks in afterwards, and we rationalize, and so we don't really think about things in a rational way. Oftentimes, we're emotionally. Someone will say something, we get emotional about it, and that doesn't help us at all learn to
So
work together.
in my book, I do talk about some of those differences. There are left-right ideological differences in system one versus system two thinking, in heuristic versus systematic processing, in cognitive reflection. It is the case that conservatives often trust their intuitions much more than liberals do. And sometimes there are confounds with education and so on, or sometimes education is part of the explanation for those differences.
I remain hopeful, John. I
I know
do.
you do, and
I
I
remain
love that about you.
I remain hopeful that we can find a way to recognize that we need people on the left and people on the right, but we need them working together. We need them collaborating. We don't need them in confrontation. And I'm hopeful that we're going to work through this and find that common ground.
Yes. Well, I mean, you're a conflict resolution expert, so I'm sure you know there's healthier kinds of conflict and unhealthier kinds of conflict. And, it's okay to disagree and to do so in a civil manner and express differences of beliefs, opinions, and values. I think the problem is it's a question now whether we're all playing by democratic rules, or whether those have been thrown by the wayside so that one group can win every time.
We have a couple more audience questions, if we could go there. In a world so dominated with fake news, surveillance, and misinformation, how can a democracy function based on trusting the crowds if public information is so heavily controlled by the media?
Yeah, I think we have to consider the source. We can't just take information that is out there as equally credible as information that is being endorsed by trustworthy sources that might include having some credentials, having some checks, having some epistemic standards in place. I think that's always been the case within democracies. There's always been a market for disinformation in some sense. There's always been pamphleteers, and there's always been, but the problem is it's clearly exacerbated because there's so much more of it, and some of the algorithms on social media seem to be favoring lies over the truth. Maybe because they're more distinctive and unique at first, or maybe because they're more emotionally energizing, or for whatever reason, the criteria now are emotional and psychological rather than logical, rational, consistent with epistemic standards of rationality, for instance. Yeah.
Thank
Or
you.
expertise.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if this question needs more context, but one of the attendees has asked, can we leave politicians out of this?
I mean, if when you think about the actual politicians, certainly I would love to leave most of them out of everything, but I don't see how we really do that unless we set up an anarchic society, and then we have a whole nother set of problems that we have to think about how we're going to solve. Um, I would rather, I think, have a truly democratic system where there's accountability for bad faith actors in the political sphere, and they're held accountable to laws, to the Constitution, to the people, and that the people and that there is good information that is getting to people rather than bad information. Yeah.
Thank you for
I
that.
still, Fred is optimistic about something. I still haven't seen a system that I would prefer over liberal democracy.
Thank you. And can you address the social media platforms? So this is kind of a longer question, but in Left and Right, you emphasize how psychological differences between ideological camps shape information processing and motivated reasoning. Given the increasing ideological sorting across social media platforms, such as conservatives and liberals gravitating toward different spaces like X and Blue Sky, do you see this platform level segregation as qualitatively worsening the psychological and societal dangers of social media, or something else?
Um, I think yeah I think I think what happened to Twitter is a tragedy. Um, I think it wasn't just a place that was comfortable for conservatives. It became um, reaching out to the far right to give them megaphones, and that is a threat to democracy in the U.S. and everywhere. Um, I think it would be better, yeah, if we could all agree on certain parameters and that we're going to tolerate a lot, but we're not going to tolerate intolerance. And there has to be a line that's drawn, and there always was in liberal democracy. And when people stop drawing that line, uh, even if they say it's for freedom of speech or something like that, which I doubt is the true motive, to be honest with you, even if they say that, I don't think we can have a democracy anymore if we don't respect some of those boundaries. Um, you know, so I don't know. Blue Sky is a last ditch effort for people to who miss Twitter to connect with each other. They're just doing the best they can, I think. Um, so far, I haven't seen it opening up to North Korean communism or anything like that.
Thank you. Fred, do you want to ask one final question before we?
Well, I don't think I can ask any final questions because there's always going to be questions, but I do want to thank you for your research, your continued research, the information that you provided. I hope that it will inspire people to go out, find, and support candidates. And I don't care whether they're on the right or the left, but go out, find, and support candidates that will work together, regardless of whether they're left and right. So thank you for your research and thank you for this talk, John.
It's my pleasure. And I hope that those people do adhere to the rule of law and to the Constitution. And I think we need to demand that they do, honestly. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you everyone for joining us. Join us for the next talk in this series on February 5th with Dr. Beverly Tatum. The link will be in the chat. Find out more about other programs, resources, and services for people of all ages at bpl.org. Thank you all for joining us, and good night.